Good evening, and thank you for joining us. It's September 3rd at 7 p.m. We're here to talk about wastewater treatment capital funding for the Merrill Crescent Wastewater Service Area. My name is Kyle Doyle. I'm the Manager of Asset Management here on the Sunshine Coast. Joining us today, we have Darren Joseph, who is the Asset Coordinator, and Cody Abbott, who is the Utility Operations Superintendent. Just a few housekeeping matters. We're going to go through about a 20-minute presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, there's a chat function in the Zoom app, and you're able to just type in a question there, and if staff can answer it, they'll answer it directly. If your question's a bit more involved, we might come to it at the end of the meeting. If your question isn't something you can type, you're welcome to raise your hand using the, obviously, virtual hand in Zoom, and we'll try to get to you when we can. There will be a period at the end of the meeting where we have questions, so that's when hopefully we'll be taking hands. We'll just get started here. So on your screen there is the outline of the service area. This is the Merrill Crescent Wastewater Service Area. If your address is outside of the blue box, then this might not apply to you tonight. We're going to go over the previous review that we conducted on wastewater services across Sunshine Coast. We're going to do a quick update on the capital funding, what's changed, and where we're at in the status of putting forward a rate review for the board. And then we're going to go into what's next here on the Sunshine Coast, or specifically for Merrill Crescent, and then we'll take some questions. So starting in 2019, we conducted a wastewater service review, which looked at all the wastewater services on the Sunshine Coast. Following that up, we did an in-depth review of each of the services. This put together all the information in one place for staff to work with. It gave us an asset inventory and preliminary cost estimates going forward for capital funding and operations. We went out to community in December and January of 2019 and 2020. We hosted a series of engagement sessions and started to gather some feedback on our preliminary work from the residents. We tried to post some fact sheets onto the SCRD website to allow residents to refer to the data we talked about. And then we went forward to the board and talked about the findings of our review. And a rate adjustment was made in 2020. Some of the key findings of the 2019 wastewater service review were that the existing revenue was unsustainable. The operations budget was often greater than the revenues generated for operations from user fees, and that meant that the contributions to the reserve funds were frequently deferred. The bottom line was that the future capital expenditures were not planned for, and that the ratio of capital reserves to future capital expenses was far too low. Just a recap on how the previous funding model worked. We collected frontage fees from every parcel in the service area, and we collected user fees from every parcel that was connected to the wastewater service. Both of these revenue streams were put together into the operating budget, and the operating budget paid for the annual operations expenditure, and it contributed to the capital and operation reserves. Some key outcomes of the review was the decoupling of the user fees and frontage fees. We no longer use one common pot of money to fund things. We have user fee revenue only funds the operations and maintenance expenses, and the frontage fees only fund capital expenses. This is a more transparent system and allows for easier accountability on our end and for your end. We conducted an extensive review of the operation and maintenance requirements of every wastewater system on the Sunshine Coast. We audited the operation and maintenance activities, and once we did that, we revised the operations and maintenance budget to ensure that adequate funding was available to conduct the work that needed to be done. We established a minimum reserve target for operations and maintenance reserves to ensure that when work had to be done, money was there to do the work. This process is an annual process going forward, and we'll review what our operations and maintenance budget is, and therefore the user fees, on an annual basis. We also developed a capital funding model to help us plan for future capital expenses. This is a diagram that represents what the current funding model looks like. You can see that there's two parallel revenue streams. User fees fund operations and maintenance and contribute to the operation and maintenance reserve. Frontage fees fund capital expenditures and contribute to the capital reserve. A common question we've received over the last several months is, why do we need an operating reserve? Obviously, unforeseen repairs can exceed an annual operating budget if a pump fails or something like that. And due to the nature of the regional district inside the provincial government framework, we're unable to borrow for operational expenses. These have to be funded through revenue. Operating reserves are only withdrawn and used for work within your service area. There is no cross-boundary financial transfers for wastewater services or any services in a regional district. So this is still a summary. This was the impact on your wastewater rates. We found the Merrill Crescent wastewater operations and maintenance budget needed to increase by 92%. This was largely driven by that we had excessive work to do at the Merrill Crescent wastewater plant. We frequently find that pumps would burn out. And just an example, if a pump is damaged early and burns out, it's about a $1,500 expense for the product. And then the work that has to be done to put it in can almost double that cost. So depending on the situation, if the tank is full, it needs to be pumped out. Costs can exceed $3,000 quite easily. And as there's only 14 parcels and 12 users right now in Merrill Crescent, those costs are shared across a small number of users. In 2019, the user fee was $684. In 2020, that climbed to $1,499 for an increase of $814. We've also noticed that there's an operating reserve contribution in 2020. This is because Merrill Crescent had a very low operating reserve, and the target that we've set for this wastewater service is $5,000. You can see the frontage fee for 2020 was eliminated because there is an ongoing debt payment. We did this just as a mitigation of rate increase to minimize the impact of the operation increases last year. Going forward, we do need to look at increasing the frontage fee to pay for future capital expenses. I'm going to come back to the operating reserve contribution because we do have some good news. So during our engagement sessions, we learned a lot talking to the residents. We got a lot of comments that our estimates were too conservative. And so we went back and analyzed historical SCRD contract data, and we refined long-term our capital model by reducing our engineering estimates. We've reduced our contingency we consider necessary. We also looked at a higher tolerance for debt from the residents for funding future capital projects, where we might have tried to fund things, upcoming capital expenses, 100% or as high as possible. We've looked at options where debt funding can be used to fund these expenses. And finally, we heard a lot about rate uncertainty and the fear of increasing rates, especially on residents who might be on fixed incomes. And everyone in general likes to have some certainty in their life. So we're looking at creating a 5-year rate structure for all wastewater services. This will be revised annually, where the 5th year is changed every budget cycle. This hopefully provides residents with advance notice of the upcoming rate structure and some more certainty and ease in financial planning in the future. Other stuff we've changed is we've updated the savings and borrowing rates to match the current financial situation in the world, and we introduced a variable borrowing rate based on the term of the anticipated loan for the infrastructure. We also applied a variable construction cost index instead of a single flat rate for all inflationary estimates. We looked at different periods and how construction inflation has historically performed and introduced this into our model. So just before we get into the capital plans and the funding that we'll be talking about tonight, I just wanted to go over a few points I think we might have talked about in our previous engagement session, but just to bring everyone up to speed. So there is a confining framework in the provincial government that means local service areas and regional districts cannot be funded only by participants, and this means the costs are shared by a small number of people. All infrastructure degrades over time, which has reduced performance and higher maintenance costs as it ages. And it's also to remember that what we pay for something now is not the same as what we can expect to pay in 50 years when it's time to replace it. So infrastructure cost inflates over time. This is a little discussion on how we came up with our capital funding plan, just to provide some background for people and a little bit more in-depth understanding. First, we developed a timeline of anticipated replacements using estimated useful life of the infrastructure. We then took the most recent similar replacement cost estimates from either the specific infrastructure that's being replaced or other systems within the SCRD that have similar needs and infrastructure. We inflated the cost to the future value using the construction cost indexes we introduced previously. We included the cost of debt financing to make sure we captured the additional cost of borrowing money. And then where reserves were accrued, we applied an annual interest rate and accrued interest based on how much you would make for saving the money. Some key points are that we did use the most recent replacement cost estimates to avoid excessive inflationary estimates, effects, I suppose. And when we talk about useful life of infrastructure, like we talked about in previous engagement sessions, there are three main components to a wastewater service. There's a treatment plant, a disposal system, and a collection system. And these three components have different lifespans, and this has influenced the decision of what time frame we choose to review when we're making our capital models. So we're just going to take a look here, give you an idea of the process of coming up with a capital model. This is the 30-year anticipated expenditure for capital projects in Merrill Crescent. We have coming up in 2032 a treatment plant that we estimate to cost $310,000. Historically, the frontage fees at Merrill Crescent have increased $2.72 a year. Obviously, it hasn't been applied every year, but that's the average rate across the years since we took over in 1996. And what we see down here is what the reserve balance would be if we continued on the historical rate increases we've done in the past. And you can see there's less than 10% of the reserves built up by 2032 when it's time to replace this treatment plant. Now what I've added to the chart is a yellow line that represents the frontage fee increase that would be corresponding with the level of debt associated with the reserve balance we've saved up for 2032. So out of $310,000, we need to borrow, 85% of that. And that means we have a minimum debt payment coming into the next year of $1,300.62. That sort of jump is not ideal for financial planning, as it creates an inequitable situation and a very tough one for the residents at the time to handle. If you had a 1 year went from $250 and next year went to $1,350, it's a pretty massive accommodation of financial. So that increase there is due to the loan payments. If we pull the window back a little bit and we look at the 50-year window, we can see that coming up in the future, we have to replace the collection system. And this cost estimate is what we think it's going to cost in 2067 based on inflationary rates and the historical prices of labor in here. So when we go back to that previous graph, if we just pull it into here, we can see that we have to inflate frontage fees significantly, and we still don't save up much reserve going into 2067 for that large expenditure there. So this current plan has a huge spike in it, and that to us is a major red flag when we're making our financial plans, because it's just not fair to anyone to have that sort of jump at any one point. If we continue to look, we capture further and further infrastructure expenditures, but it gets to a point where it's not reasonable to expect to plan for things, and technology changes. So we're going to look at a 50-year range, and as things come into that window, we'll take care of them then. There may be updated estimates on costs that allow us to refine our model. So now we're getting into some of the proposed plans and some ways to avoid these big price spikes going forward, fee spikes. We're going to present two models, and one of them, we're going to present another model where we receive a grant in the near future for the first infrastructure project we have coming up in 2032. So this model, proposed plan number one, the frontage fees increase $100 a year from 2020 to 2030. Currently, the $227 there represents the debt payment. So we're going from a frontage fee of 0 and a debt payment of $227. We're building up from there. In 2033, we do increase in debt for that capital expenditure, but there's no spike in the frontage fee because we're already paying more than that. And then there's a 2% annual increase from 2030 to 2069. This 2% increase is matched to what's called CPI, and that's a inflationary rate that's pretty common to measure how much things get more expensive around the world from year to year. So by having a 2% inflationary increase in a frontage fee, we make sure that the frontage fee you pay in 2035 is equivalent to the frontage fee in 2050 in that year's dollars. So this is a flat rate fee, but it's just inflation takes care of the increase in the cost of things. In this scenario, we don't assume there's a grant received. So the next line that we put on the graph here is the reserve balance that we anticipate to result from this plan. As you can see, we save about 50% for the project coming up and about 80% for the next one. What if a grant is awarded? So in this scenario, as we approach 2032 and we're starting to get plans together for this new project, we're going to apply for as many grants as we can from provincial and federal governments and any organization. And so we wanted to model a scenario where we were awarded a 30% grant, or a grant that's worth 30% of the construction value of the upcoming work. And we want to assume it was awarded 2 years prior to this planned construction date. So if we follow on this plan and we increase to $100 a year from 2020 to 2029, in which year we're awarded a capital infrastructure grant, we can then reduce the frontage fee. Our debt payment going forward for the next 10 years there is $625 per person, and we have a 2% annual increase from 2029 to 2069. Under this scenario, again, we have sufficient reserves for both plants or both projects coming up. We then looked at another scenario where we did a $50 a year increase to just minimize the impact on the next couple of years. We ended up having a small spike in 2033 where the debt payment increases the frontage fee from, it looks about $740 at that point to $913. Continuing at 2% annual increase, we then get into trouble because our reserve balance in 2067 is so low, the debt payment forces us to raise the frontage fee almost $3,500 there. So this isn't an ideal plan. And one way to solve this, if we wanted to do a low amount of increase in the beginning, is to change that inflationary increase across the 2030 to 2069 years. So we looked at, what if we did a 3.5% annual inflation from 2030 to 2069? And this still works. You get a small spike in 2067 there, moving from $2,900 to $3,400 almost. But the problem with this, and one of the issues when you increase your fee at a higher rate than the inflation, is that it's inequitable to future owners. They're paying more equivalent money than current owners are. So there's a little bit of inequity there, and this isn't the preferred way to handle things. So what we're going to look at here is a comparison of the three plans that we've put forward. Proposed plan one is the green line, and that is a fairly modest increase and then building considerable reserves for the future. Plan two with the grant assumes that we've received a grant. That's the purple line, and you can see that would be probably the most financially favorable across the whole term. Obviously receiving federal aid for infrastructure is ideal. And then the third plan in red where we have a bit of a higher rate of increase, and it eventually ends up being the most expensive. So as we were talking about a 5-year rate structure, we're going to look at this for the next 5 years and how this impacts you. As there's developments in the future, these plans will be revised if we have more accurate estimates, or if we receive a grant or anything like that. But for the next 5 years, we're looking at the following as our financial situation. Now, we're going to talk quickly here about the 3 options, but I want to come back to the reserve contribution, which you see in the second column from the left. Currently, we're looking at a $240 and change reserve contribution. This is to help build the operations reserve at Merrill Crescent. Now, fortunately, we were awarded the grant that we applied for the feasibility study. This means that we have reduced our anticipated expenditure out of the operation reserve. So we hope that the 5-year term for this reserve contribution will be able to be reduced depending on what the cost of that feasibility study are and what the outcomes of this year's operations budget review is. Now, moving on to the frontage fee plans, you can see Plan 1 and Plan 2 over the next 5 years mirror each other because we don't anticipate receiving the grant in the next 5 years. If there's an opportunity, once we have the feasibility study received and there's concrete information that we can apply for a grant and advance the construction of that treatment plant, we would look to apply for a grant where there was an opportunity. But we're currently assuming that we'll be looking for grants 2 years outside the currently anticipated construction date. And the alternative plan on the side there sums up the totals if we follow the $50 a year increase for the next 5 years. So we're just going to put a little poll up on the screen here. We've been asked to collect a little bit of feedback from residents on their thoughts on what was presented. So I'm just going to try to put this up. Okay, polls up there, so you're welcome to just take a look of the 3 plans that you saw presented today, which is the most preferable for yourselves. Okay, we'll just move on. So coming up for Merrill Crescent, we're going to finalize the capital fund model. We're going to present a 5-year rate structure to the board for consideration. They'll make a decision either on when we present or when they think is best. We're going to be getting a feasibility study going here soon, and we'll review the results of that feasibility study, what it tells us about the condition of the Merrill Crescent wastewater treatment plant, and what direction it gives us going forward. And where we can, we'll apply for grants for upcoming work. We're going to review the operations and maintenance budget on an annual basis and just refine the projection of maintenance costs and ensure that the operating reserve is appropriate. In conclusion, there are several ways to finance 50-year capital expenditures. It's important to maintain updated estimates as new cost information becomes available and to revise the capital plan accordingly. An important takeaway is that our current revenue to maintain this system and other systems on the Sunshine Coast is not financially sustainable. And the good news is that we did receive a grant for a feasibility study, and we're going to be able to move forward to improve this service. So it's at this time that we'll take questions. I saw a hand earlier, and I'm a little bit new to hosting Zoom, so I apologize I wasn't able to react, but if you want to throw your hand up now, we can take your question.
Hi there. Um, what are the annual?
Hi there, Tess. I think you were asking what the annual maintenance fees are for the Merrill Crescent system.
Yes.
So I'm just going to pull that information up here real quick. Current operating budget for the Merrill Crescent wastewater service is $1,499 times 12. Because that is the operations, or your O&M, your user fee, I should say. It's come up, I believe, 92% since last year, once we did this review. We've had several years where the variance in the operations budget was more than 100% of what the budget amount was because of continued service calls up in that area, unfortunately. So the budget for 2020 was $17,900 approximately. If there's any other questions, I'm happy to take an email. Or you can look up on the website here for some more information, www.scrd.ca/Merrill Crescent, Merrill-Crescent, or www.scrd.ca/wastewater. It's troubling sometimes for our staff how frequently they find debris and other non-body fluids in the wastewater system at Merrill Crescent. And so there is an ongoing effort to inform residents and to pass on information. And if there's anyone who'd like to take on a championship role within the community, reach out to us and we can help facilitate. Because like I said earlier, if one pump burns out because someone throws a rope down into the toilet and it clogs up a pump, it can cost everyone on an individual basis, as much as $300, $400, that one pump, because there's only so few of you and the costs are quite high.
I just would like to say that there's a lot of people that don't think that it's fair that some people are doing things that are ruining the system and the rest of the people have to pay for it.
I agree, and we're looking at ways to reach out and inform the community. And if it gets to it, we're gonna look into enforcement methods if necessary. It is hard to it's not like giving a speeding ticket where you see the guy go by real fast and then you give him a ticket. It's a bit tougher to be absolutely sure who is doing what. We've heard some stories, and we appreciate that it's concerning, and there are a lot of great residents that are trying hard to do the right thing. So we're going to look at education and information and outreach where we can, because user error is contributing to the excessive operations costs in this system particularly. Sorry, I keep muting you. It's just that I get a mean feedback if I try to talk while you're muted or not muted.
That's okay. Some of the properties are rentals, and we understand that. I also understand that a lot of people want to maintain the good neighbor policy. So to be the hero and take on the Crescent is not something viable for a lot of us because we all have to live together. However, it seems like when you guys were aware of some of the problems, it's like education didn't seem to work for those people, and I want to know why nothing more has been done to sort of eliminate the problem or make it more clear to those individuals that that's important for the rest of the Crescent to have to live with. I guess I just don't know what else to say, but I thank you for taking my questions.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's not fair, and it's not fun to be held hostage by other people because you're in a shared situation like that. So we're going to do what we can, and your comments are heard. This is something Director Lee is aware of, who's your area representative. We've had discussions about this, and it's not a straightforward solution. Something that we'll look at hopefully during the feasibility study. Perhaps there are some engineering controls we can do, knowing that the users are maybe a little less savvy at living within a small wastewater system. So thank you for your comments. I appreciate you joining us tonight. Please share the video with anyone in your community, and it's available on YouTube. You can find the link on the Merrill Crescent website ahead of you there.
Thank you. We appreciate you taking our comments and questions, and we're just trying to understand why if it needs to be replaced in a few years, I guess we just don't have the backup funds to replace it right now, and to avoid all the upcoming further maintenance on this broken system that we seem to have.
Yeah, we will continue to do everything we can to expedite, receiving financial aid through grants if it's available, and we can replace the system earlier, and we have the capacity within our staff to do it. It's definitely a high priority item for the utility staff. We're aware of the issues, and it's something that concerns us as well. Okay, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone for watching. I hope you have a great night, and we'll see you next time.